Okay, great. We are a little early, so we're not going to actually start until it hits 10 o'clock, and then we'll have the introductions, okay?
Okay.
Okay, great. We are a little early, so we're not going to actually start until it hits 10 o'clock, and then we'll have the introductions, okay? Hello, everybody. I just wanted to go ahead and start. I do want to let everybody know, just give everybody a little trigger warning that this can be traumatic. For those who have already experienced homelessness or some trauma. So please do be aware of that, that we may have some triggering statements made. I do just want to give that fair trigger warning. Also, we are unable to see comments from other people or here on the platform, so just know that we are not ignoring you. This is a purpose to have a discussion between the three of us here. If you would like to ask any questions or if you would like to have any additional information, then we may have a little bit of time at the end of this discussion to be able to ask those questions. I am not able to promise that at this moment, though. I would like to go ahead and introduce our first guest speaker on our podcast. This is very exciting. Diana Cooper.
Hi, yes, thank you. My name is Diana Cooper. I am the Executive Director for Brookings CORE Response, and we are an organization in Brookings, Oregon. We provide services for people who are unsheltered, at risk of being unsheltered, or who have very high needs and are under the poverty level, in this case, making less than what you would need to kind of survive in middle class housing here. So we provide outreach, we provide advocacy on a personal level with individuals and their providers, or on a more social level and a more global level with our state legislatures, our local governments, and even sometimes speaking or writing letters on a federal level. And we also provide education, community education, and education to individuals as well. So we provide a variety of services. Mainly, we do not provide crisis response, but we do provide long-term case management and really coming alongside individuals and families who have experienced a lot of trauma and are looking to find stability. I'm happy to be here.
Thank you, Diana. I do want to pass it over.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Ramona, Resiliency Coordinator for Oasis Advocacy. My job is to help and get survivors, try to help them get back on their feet with resources and learnings and teachings. And I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. My name is Mary Pat, and I am the Executive Director here at Oasis Advocacy and Shelter. We know and see a lot of you guys that are confused, that you guys think that Oasis only provides shelter, but we do also provide advocacy services, also support mentorship and housing services as well. We do have a rental assistance program, as well as a resilience program, which Ramona had mentioned. And we are also working on launching our sexual assault response program, where we are working with survivors of sexual assault who are currently in need of same-exam sexual assault kits. They're needing those, they've been completed in the hospital, and so we'll have staff who will go with them to the hospital and support and advocate through that. And then also afterwards, they will be working with them for a period of time to work through their trauma. So here at Oasis, we do a lot of trauma response, and we are a trauma response agency. So that is a little different between Oasis and with Brookings CORE. And so today, as you can see, we do a lot of trauma work. And so you may be asking yourself, what is trauma work? Some of you guys may not be familiar. What is trauma? Diana, did you want to go ahead and start us off with that?
Yeah. I think we've all experienced some sort of trauma in our life, and it can be difficult to place that into the category of trauma sometimes because we don't always know the definition or how that affects us. Trauma is typically a damaging situation, whether it's physically or emotionally. It's something that leaves an imprint on our brain that sort of wires the pathways between stress and fight or flight. And so it really strengthens those pathways so that when we're feeling stress, we tend to resort back to that fight or flight, regardless of whether or not it is a real threat. And so sometimes trauma can leave an imprint that makes us respond to non-life-threatening situations in a way that seems life-threatening. But typically trauma is a major event. Sometimes it can be very minor though and repetitive over a long period of time and gradually increases in its stress level. And so it is difficult sometimes for all of us to identify an event in our life as traumatic, especially when we were able to get through it okay. Some of us have more safety nets than others. And so trauma is really about those events that are happening that we're in the middle of and the impact that it has on us long term if we do not get support. So that's kind of the basic definition of trauma.
Thank you, Diana. I did also want to throw in there that it's important to remind ourselves that how every person responds to trauma can be different. So maybe there might be a specific type of trauma, for example, a divorce. Divorce is a form of trauma because divorce, you're losing somebody important in your life. Maybe that important person is no longer important. However, that long-term relationship that you had with the person it is a loss. So, how people respond to divorce, for example, a person needing a divorce might be done with it, but they may still have some of that trauma in the back of their minds. But how you move on with your life may depend on how you're able to handle that. Maybe during your marriage, you had already grieved during the marriage. And then moving forward, when it was actually finalized, maybe it was more of a relief. But that process is still traumatic. So you just want to remind everybody that it's imperative that we do not expect everybody to measure trauma in the same ways. So Ramona, did you want to add anything to that?
A definition for me in trauma would be the, homelessness, because it's a different experience compared to divorce or something happening in your world. It has a different definition for, like, my example would be homelessness for a short period of time, and I'm very grateful. But during that time, it was traumatic for me and my daughter, because we had nothing except for our cars. So yeah, trauma definitely has a different definition for most.
Yeah, and I want to add to that too, and I know we're going to talk about resilience later, and some of the reason why trauma has a different, not necessarily that maybe trauma has a different definition, but when it hits us, we define that differently, and we get to define what's trauma for us and what's not. And sometimes we don't understand until later that what we've experienced had an impact on us. But some of the reason why that impact is different for each person is because of resilience. And resilience is sort of like, if stress is tripping and trauma is hitting the floor, resilience is what is the floor made of? How much cushion do we have? And that can be because we have different social supports and different, financial supports. And so sometimes people who have a little bit more cushion, maybe landing on carpet, aren't as injured. And it can be difficult to understand different people's type of trauma if you take it out of context and you don't look at everything else in their life. And so that's a really good point, Maya.
Thank you.
And I also wanted to add that now you had mentioned something so important for us to remember, and this really ties in with homelessness. Some people avoid being homeless because they have privilege. So privilege may look different for everybody. So you call it a cushion, I may call it privilege. You know, so for example, a deaf person, a hearing person may have easier access to go into that social security office and get all the information that they need right in that moment. Where a deaf person may have to go in, request the interpreter, wait 2 weeks, finally go back. So in that 2-week time frame, more things may happen. They can't apply for food stamps, they can't do this, that, and the other because they're unable to go in and get the resource support they need right there at the moment. You also can think about people who may be in different, different classes, different wealth levels. Maybe somebody who's more wealthy has safety, so if they lose their home, no big deal, I can just go live at a hotel, I can afford it. Or, oh, I can just buy something else right now. Or I can go live with my friends or family. They have those different support systems. So wealth also varies as well. Wealth isn't just money. Wealth is also that social support, the family support, people that love and care about you or who are able to. You also have to remember not everybody is able to help. Just because somebody loves and cares for you does not mean that they're in a capacity to provide the support for you at that moment in time as well. So, there are also different factors to consider that do impact people, and it impacts people and how they treat other people who are being homeless. Before we do a deep dive into trauma, I do want to come back to homelessness. Mona, can you touch on homelessness and what that means?
Well, for me specifically, it's not having a solid foundation of safety, a place to be able to, feel safe, do things for yourself, cook and, not have the resources to be able to go and help yourself. A place to be able to, feel safe.
And I can add a little to that. I very much, I was also homeless, and so even though Mona and I were homeless, we probably experienced very different things, but all of which led to, trauma that has followed me. Even now, I still experience trauma around finances, and my biggest fear, even though I've been housed for almost 10 years, my biggest fear is losing my home, and it causes me to, what some would see as a benefit, it causes me to really track every single penny and stress about every single purchase, and to kind of quite an extreme. And when you're homeless, I like how Mona said, it's a place for safety, because when you're homeless, you don't even have to have a mental health condition. We all experience stress, and at home, I can go into my room, shut my door, tell everybody to leave me alone for 5 minutes, and get just enough of a reprieve that my emotions aren't sore and exposed, and I can come back out and deal with the world, and that's resilience. But having no space to be able to just take that 5 seconds can cause a lot of outbursts and a lot of anger or sadness that people who don't understand perceive to be as mental illness or addiction, and that can play a part. But just because somebody's struggling on the street does not mean they have severe mental illness, and it does not mean that they have addiction. Those are just added factors. And when you're homeless, you're exposed. So people see everything about you, and you don't have the right or the privilege, as Mary Pat said, to not speak to someone for a few minutes, because it could even be law enforcement, and then you have to speak to them.
Yes, and that is trauma itself. And that's really a big reason why we're talking today about that intersection. You know, really, you can't be homeless without trauma. The intersection is there. It is trauma itself. Homelessness is a traumatic experience, and it's traumatic for everyone. You know, how severe or how high the level of trauma, that part will vary. You know, some people are homeless for one day, some people are homeless for most of their lives. We have seen kids who have been homeless their entire lives. You know, and why they're homeless really depends on the different reasons. You know, everybody says you are one paycheck away from being homeless. You know, and for those who have savings, for those who have housing, you know, your house could burn down in a matter of a day. And then maybe insurance says, sorry, but it was intentional. We're not paying out. And you still have a $3,000 mortgage payment that you have to pay. How do you add another mortgage on top of that to your expenses? Maybe you don't have that luxury. So there are so many ways people are put onto the streets. Now here in Curry County, there is a huge problem with investors. You know, people are purchasing properties out from under people and pushing them out. And what are they doing when they're being evicted? Well, they're renovating the houses, and then they're flipping the people who are purchasing, investing. They're flipping them, and then they're selling for, you know, maybe double or triple the cost, or maybe they're renting it out for also double, triple, quadruple the cost. And so it is a huge problem here in Curry County. Just a few months ago, somebody that I was talking with, you know, their sisters, their entire street. I mean, even though the houses weren't for sale, their entire street went under this. But it's because of all of these rental properties. I mean, they literally sold all of these houses on this block for double. And this happened 3 years ago. So the prices 3 years ago compared to now are exponential. I mean, they are absolutely ridiculous. So here, yes, we are seeing those exponential increases in homelessness. Now, last week we talked about point in time count. And Diana, do you recall what that number was for, what was it, 2021 versus 2023? It was doubled.
So we haven't officially gotten all of the count back yet from the count that happened earlier this year in 2022. In 2020, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but I want to say down here in Brookings, which I know, you know, we talked a lot about Curry County, and we obviously are very interconnected with the agencies in Curry County. But we really focus on Brookings, and so I tend to focus that way. So I'm glad that you guys kind of bring it back to the whole county. I can say I know that our count down here in Brookings, I believe, was less than 50 in 2020. And well, maybe have to correct this at the next one. You might have to give a correction. And in 2021, due to COVID and everything happening, there wasn't going to be a count. And so our agency partnered with a few others here in Brookings, and it's only required, the counts are only required every 2 years on the even numbers. And so on the odd numbers, it's just if we have the capacity to do it. And at that time, there wasn't as much capacity through the county and through our community action. So our agency partnered with a few others to go out and do the count, at least in Brookings and Harvard. We wanted to know. We knew we were seeing a huge increase, and we wanted to know. And what we saw was roughly a 155% increase in people experiencing homelessness just in Brookings Harbor. So I can imagine what that looks like in Gold Beach and Port Orford and all the, smaller communities in between. And so we were able to kind of compile that data, and those numbers haven't, they've shifted some. Now that restrictions have eased, some people have kind of left the community and went elsewhere. But like you said, we've seen such an increase in short-term, an increase in short-term rentals and a decrease in long-term rentals and housing availability that, one of the things that we hear a lot about, and I'm sure, Mona, you've heard this probably, and Mary Pat, I'm sure heard this as well, is that, it's choices, it's making choices, and people are making good choices. And what I had to say to that, especially when it's so obvious that we're in a housing shortage, is that you can't state that everything is a result of choices, because it isn't necessarily about making good choices, it's about having good choices. And here in Curry County, when it comes to housing, we have very few choices. So the count is reflective of that. We see in the last few years, our housing crisis has gotten worse, and we didn't know that that was possible. And our resources have really tried to ramp up, but with all of the compounding factors from COVID, from the wildfires, and just in general, stress has increased in households. And, for whatever reason, this huge jump in short-term rentals, which I personally think has to do with the closures and the lockdowns, though while necessary to mitigate the spread of COVID, it created a cycle where it was easier to get into a Airbnb to go vacation because the motels were shut down. And so if you look at supply and demand, just basic economics, you'll see that short-term rentals were in high demand. And if you wanted to make money, that was the way to do it. And so people who did have wealth, which is different than having just money, wealth is the ability to borrow money. If you can borrow something, you are better off than just having it because you can shift resources. So people who had a lot of wealth were able to borrow and purchase and make a profit. And unfortunately, that impacted my work, your work, and a lot of the work that we're trying to do in the community to make people stable. So.
Wow. Very true. I'm still trying to find a home myself. So, yeah, I get it. But you're right, not a choice, not an option. It just happened. And I'm still trying to find a home myself. Through family and resources such as Oasis and stuff, because I was not domestic violence or anything like that. It just happened, and it was very traumatic when it happened, but I didn't give it the opportunity to take over. I just kept going and I kept going. She's right. Airbnbs. When you're living from paycheck to paycheck, it's hard to even get somebody to talk to you or take time for you to try and get that short-term housing, or, because you don't have great credit. It's hard to get to borrow. So yeah, it's a choice, but in a way it's a choice, not always a choice. There are plenty of options, and it's up to you to make, to look at the options and what's going to benefit you or, your family. And for a lot of places like in Curry County, pets, that it's like for me, okay, I have 3 dogs. I chose to not get rid of my pets to get into a home. And so that was a choice, correct. But they're like children, and so I wanted to, I'm going to keep going because that's, just who I am. I just want to make sure that it's right and that it's, affordable. And I just wanted to take my opportunity with resources to help myself along with anybody else that I felt could use those. Like Diane's program, not necessarily Oasis, but I've gone through the food banks and all that stuff. So those were choices that I made, but not everybody gets that opportunity to make those choices because of maybe some mental illness or, people won't look at you when you have certain situations in your world. And I mean my world, for example, because I was only homeless for so long, well, I guess I'm still considered homeless. I'm in a trailer. And so when you are homeless for like my reasons or for anybody else's reasons to make the choices or the options, it's kind of hard. That would be a traumatic situation, I think, for myself. Well, personally, I think it's traumatic to have to try to make choices and options and look at the options to be able to do or make, that safe place for you.
I like how you pointed that out, Mona, that you were making choices. And you understand that both of those choices involved trauma.
Right.
And both of those choices were going to have some level of trauma in them. And you had to make the one that was least traumatic for you. And when people are looking at individuals without housing, and they're, removing the context of trauma, they're really removing the underlying reason why people are making the choices that they're making. And they're ignoring the most important part of who that person is.
Right.
For you being your animals.
Right.
And so you still didn't have good choices. You just have a couple of
right.
kind of less than choices, and so you had to make the best decision for you. And first of all, when we take trauma out of the context, when we're looking at someone who's making a decision, we're doing a disservice to them, and we're also limiting our understanding of who they are, why they do what they do. We form an opinion about that based off of our past experiences and our bias. And I think that we do not give trauma the weight that it deserves.
Correct.
When people are making decisions.
Yeah,
so
like
I really, appreciate that.
I like you said, there are different forms of trauma. I mean, yeah, it's really definable for each person because it's always so different. Because like me, just an eviction. I've got relatives that, domestic violence, sexual assault. They ended up on the streets and chose not to try to use the resources that were around them because they were too traumatized. They didn't know which way to go, And a lot of family members or people that they know don't know of the resources that are available to them in their area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, not having a clear understanding of the resources is oftentimes why people are out there longer.
Right.
And, we talk about, I don't know if you've heard this, Mona or Mary Pat, but, we talk about poverty charging interest. And to me, what that feels like is the longer you're out there, the more trauma you have a chance of accumulating. And so the harder it is to make those decisions.
Right.
And even when you get out of the trauma, like, myself, I'm housed, I've been housed for almost 10 years. I don't know if you guys have heard the term paper tigers. This is a really, this isn't talking about trauma and resilience. Paper tigers are, 10,000 years ago, the most devastating and destructive threat to man was tigers. We didn't have Facebook where people were shaming you, or we didn't have all this social pressure. It was really about life or death. And so, if you were out there and you had a fire going and you were cooking over a fire and you heard rustling in the bushes behind you, you know, your stomach tightens, your blood goes into your legs and your arms so that you can get up and run. And, you know, that's the fight or flight is your muscles tense and you're ready to go. And that is a trauma response. It's also a survival mechanism.
Correct.
You know, 10,000 years ago, we would have said, oh, that's a great skill to have to keep you alive. But when you're faced with something like law enforcement or, you know, somebody who is shaming you, or you're faced with a dilemma like having to give up your dogs for housing, you know, it can reactivate this as though you are fighting a tiger and there's no tiger. And so it's called a paper tiger because it's not something that actually is going to kill you, but it triggers the same emotion and the same response. And so, you know, that definitely feels like a lot of what we see. And, you know, when people who don't understand these issues are describing things to me, reactions that seem just very out of proportion, this is what I think, you know, this is what makes sense to me, is that they're experiencing that reaction from a paper tiger, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, one thing I thought that was interesting that you had mentioned was you had said the poverty tax. You know, ironically, about 2 months ago, I went to purchase some new shoes. And I was talking with my partner, and I said, you know, at that time, I just had thought of something. They said, you know, a long time ago, they said it was a lot more expensive for a poor person to purchase a shoe than a wealthy person. And the reason for it, and people were like, well, that doesn't make sense. They could purchase a $150 pair of shoes, but your $150 pair of shoes will last 3 years, you know, even at the most wear. Versus if you purchase a $70 pair of shoes, that may last 1 year. So if you purchase 3 pairs of $70 shoes equals $210 versus that $100 pair, and that's $210 for 3 pairs. But ironically, the person chooses to purchase the expensive pair. It's not so much that they can afford it and it will last them longer, so it's more of a logical choice. But they are able to make that choice if they so choose to. Whereas a poor person only has $70, and that's a lot of money for them. And so, to me, that is how I define poverty tax. You have to pay more for the same things over time. You know, it's the same idea as, you know, people say fast food is cheaper. It's really cheaper. I mean, you can go to McDonald's and you can purchase a burger for, you know, $5 compared to purchasing a steak at the grocery store for $18.
Right.
I mean, yes, but that burger is going to give you cancer. So the doctor bills, going to chemo, and all those other auxiliaries where maybe you have to go to a nutritionist because now you have become obese because you have eaten too many burgers. All of that, though, holistically adds up. Yes, good food is expensive, and there's a reason for that, you know. I mean, but there is a reason, but it doesn't make sense. And so you just really have to remember that people that do not have homes can't cook. So they have to go out. And sometimes they might go to a restaurant, they might purchase food, they may purchase, you know, spend $10. And now at McDonald's, one meal can be $20. And so that $20 for burgers and fries and a drink is one meal. Whereas if they actually had a place to cook, maybe they would have canned beans, and they could have, or I don't know, maybe they decide they love beans and rice. And rice, what is that, $1 for a bag? And beans, 1 can, $1 as well. That is a $2 meal, and they could eat that for dinner. And so you've got those options. It's $2 compared to $20. But there's a lot of expenses, and it really ties to the bottom line of what choices do you have at hand, and that might not be any.
You know, it's interesting. I study economics and health economics, and sort of the intersection of my work And what I'm studying has been really interesting to me through the last couple of years due to our, the economic hit that the United States took and our community. Um, Imports and, produce and just shelf-stable foods, the price has gone way, way up, and we've seen double in some areas and triple in some areas with produce because we get it from other countries, and due to inflation, we've seen a lot of increase. Whereas the prices of fast food haven't increased as much. And so it actually, we've seen a huge increase in consumption of fast food because it's just cheaper. And certainly if you have no place to cook, it's a lot cheaper. It makes more sense.
Right.
It doesn't make more sense to your health. And so, yeah, we see basically these taxes on people's life and your life is literally made up of all of the moments that you take breaths. And so a tax would be taking less breaths. You die sooner, you have a shorter lifespan. And so that tax is very real. It maybe not in this moment,
Yes,
but over the period of your life, it's very real. And so it charges interest in a way that we can't quantify because it's human life. And so, yeah, I like that you pointed that out with the shoes too. I've heard an analogy like that. And when there's a concept around taxes, and I won't go into all that because it's not as interesting to other people, but there's a concept around taxes that it garners resources for the greater good, but there's actually bits of kind of what's called dead weight loss, which is like waste. And so when you're using resources in a community like we are, where we're trying to help pull people out of homelessness, without the strength of the community, without all of us working together, there's so much waste in that resource because the tax from them being homeless eats up more resources than it should. And so one of the things that we can do, which, obviously Oasis and CORE and a lot of the agencies we work with, we work very closely together for that reason so that there's less waste, people aren't struggling as hard, and we can kind of mitigate as much of that dead weight loss as possible, while using our resources effectively. So that's a good point.
yes, yeah, that's great. And I think that really leads us to our next point and talking about resilience. So here at Oasis, because we do work with survivors of violence, oftentimes there is that process where they are able to reclaim themselves. And that also includes reclaiming their understanding of foods. So here we are working on community garden, and we are learning how to grow foods and how to work and put together and to process foods. Mona, do you want to share what you did yesterday?
Love to. We took a survivor who wanted to learn how to make applesauce. So we made applesauce from scratch. Peeled the apples, cored them, cooked them up, and tomorrow I'm going to be showing her how to can them. And then we'll finish the case of apples that we got, but then we're also going to be putting in dirt for garden, and then we'll be putting the canning process too, so they can grow their food and then they can process it and then can it so that they have something, learn how to do stuff like that. And it's a step up from where they're at. A lot of them didn't know how to do things like that, or even cook a steak. A lot of survivors didn't know how to cook steaks. So we're going to be giving that kind of program to them, teachings, things like that. But yeah, we made some killer applesauce yesterday.
Well, now I want to come up and have some applesauce.
It's the first time I had it warm, and it was pretty good. Not to brag.
That's really cool, and that really it does speak to the resilience because we're trying to build resilience in people, which we go back to the concept of wealth and we apply that to social equity as opposed to just financial equity. We're trying to build as much social capital or social equity within a person, so that they have skills to lean on and they have resources to draw from. You know, they may not be able to borrow money to buy a house, although, I mean, I'm working on that myself. But, you know, if you are homeless, it's likely you're probably not going to be drawing a $500,000 loan from the bank to buy a house. But when you're struggling, you may now have someone to reach out to tell them that you're struggling. Or you may now have a new set of skills to where even though you are homeless, you are able to understand how to eat a little bit better or process some of your foods. You know, you may not have the kitchen or the facilities to do things like cook a full meal, but you have a little bit more of an understanding now, and so you can say, like, well, I know that I can eat this food in this way, even if I'm on the street. And we're not wanting people to be on the street using these resources. We want to house them. We want to provide them with shelter.
And help get them back on their feet.
Get them back on their feet, yeah. And the reality is we have to help people build that social equity and that social capital.
Yeah, try to make them feel like they're,
Yes.
you know, they can do stuff for themselves. You know, get a little bit of weight off their shoulders.
Yes. Mhm. And you know, so that's why housing is the first one. It is critical.
Very critical.
You know, for us at Oasis, we do work with the survivors who are in our shelters. And so when they are in the shelter, you know, they do have housing. And that's not what we define as housing. I do just want to clarify that. Yes, we do provide housing. However, they need to have their own space. And so we do work with the emergency shelter as a transition from the streets. It's the housing first model. And so we need something between. And so right now, when they're in emergency shelters, they are in a crisis. They're in crisis mode. And so they need to be able to transition. And they need that time to be able to process, mentally process the crisis, and process all those steps that they need to take. And then when they're ready, we work with them towards that housing. And so that's why Project Turnkey is so imperative here. And the reason for that is because with this project, we work towards the goals of providing permanent homes or long-term, short-term rentals, you know, depending on what it is that they need. So they will have 2 years, and they'll be able to explore their long-term solutions. They'll be able to save their finances and be able to find that way up, that step up that they need. So if they have housing first, if we follow that model, then what can they do next? Anything.
Yeah, it opens the door to them. You know, when I talked about the paper tigers earlier, when a person is in constant crisis, they're constantly in survival mode, and this is not some magic thought process that, you know, some of us created. The science is there that when a person is in crisis all the time, those neural pathways connected between stress response and fight or flight are so hypervigilant that the person cannot often pull themselves out of it. It's just, we've seen people who they cannot pull themselves out of it. They require assistance, and we all do it sometimes. You know, if I have a heart attack, I'm not pulling myself out of that. I'm going to have to go to the hospital. And we need a hospital service for people who are in crisis, you know, like Oasis is providing for survivors. And giving them that space to step back and see that tiger for what it is, and be able to gain the skills to understand that, okay, this specific paper tiger is not a threat to me. And now I know how to handle this situation when it comes up, so I'm not going to go to that fight or flight this time. And it takes a long time. I was in a housing first model in Jackson County, and I was there for 11 and a half months, just barely shy of a year. And I still think, I could have used another year. I'm grateful for the experience I had, and it gave me time to step back and not, after a couple of months or even really a couple of weeks of being in there, I was able to see some of the patterns that I was going through while I was on the street. And, I did have addiction, and so mine was really intertwined with that addiction. But having a space where people supported me, and when I said the crazy things that I said, they validated me and said, yeah, those were real threats, but you're not in danger anymore, and we're going to be here for you. And so I needed all of that. And I'm very hopeful about Project Turnkey, and I'm very grateful for Oasis and the support that you already do provide in our community, because it's the only shelter that we have. And so we just need more safety net. We need more carpet to lay for people when they're falling. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Okay, we'll go on clap.
Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and wrap up. Are there any last comments that we'd like to bring to the table before we go ahead and close?
I'm so grateful to be here, and I really, really enjoyed hearing you, Mona, and getting to have a conversation with you, and
Likewise.
hearing your experiences.
Likewise, young lady.
I'm sure we'll be working a lot together.
I hope
all
so.
of you.
I really hope so. Thank you, ladies, and thanks everybody for coming. You have a wonderful day.
Yes, and thank you, Mary Pat, for putting all of this on and just being another voice in another arena. There's a lot of these conversations happening, and we need to keep happening. We need to keep having them in every arena we can, in every area we can, because there are certain people who maybe didn't hear it over here and are going to hear it today. And so I'm just grateful that you guys are doing this and putting this on. So looking forward to see all the rest of them.
Till next time, ladies. Thank you.
Thank
Toodles.
you, thank you.
Till next time, ladies.